Then the question arises, for what should we chastise our children? And that might seem like a simple question, but it's quite important. If your child, let's say, knocks over a cup of tea or coffee, whatever you drink in your house, spills on the carpet, what do? You might say that the child has been careless, clumsy, but then sometimes we as adults do that too, spill cups. You may say, and this is undoubtedly the case, that it is a nuisance to you to have to clean it up and that it may damage the carpet. Or, if the child is big enough, it can be instructive to have him get down on his hands and knees and clean it up himself. You may want to explain to the child that he needs to be more careful, take time doing things. But if it's just the way I've explained it, there's no need to get all heavy with them, because it isn't a sin as such to knock that over. If they did it on purpose or to defy you, then you're dealing with a sin. They're breaking the 5th commandment and dishonor. Then you chastise them for that. And then that's the key thing in the discipline. That's the thing about which you get angry in a righteous way. Not the fact that you have to go into the kitchen and get the cloth and mop it up. What if you have a child who wets the bed? Well, that's a nuisance. You've got to change the sheets. And maybe the child is a bit big for that sort of thing, but you're not going to beat him for it, are you? Because he's frail and weak, and we once were children too. And you're not dealing with something that is per se simple. If, on the other hand, the child lied and said it was my brother and he hopped into bed with me and he wet the bed, then you've got a discipline problem. Then the child has lied because he's broken the 9th commandment. That's the issue. Let's say you have a child who falls and puts a hole in his new jeans. And that can happen. It can happen very easily. And you say, those were brand new jeans. That cost a lot of money. And then you say, but he's a child. I'm going to tell him to be more careful. But this isn't something that I bring him home and spank him over. Because it's not per se a sin. He's not breaking any commandment. If, on the other hand, you expressly forbade him to play football or games with his friend, because he was in his good jeans and could damage it, but he went ahead and did it anyway, then he fell and tore his jeans, then you've got an issue of discipline, because he disobeyed his parents. And even then, when you're disciplined with a child, you say, yeah, you did your jeans. Yeah, that can happen. I'm not angry with you so much about the jeans, I'm angry with you because you disobeyed me. That's sinful, and you need to honour your father and your mother. And the easy way to understand what we discipline for and what we don't discipline for and what simply merits, being more careful, is this. What does God chastise us for? God does not chastise us for our frailty. He knows our frailty, we sang in Psalm 103. He takes account of it that we're all dust. God chastises us for our sins. And that's the way we chastise our children, for their sins. This, of course, is how the consistory must and does work. For their sins, you need to admonish him. So forth. Let's take some other examples. Let's say your little daughter is slow to walk or talk. Is that a sin? Ought you, as a parent, to feel terribly embarrassed about the fact? My little girl, my little boy, see me, and he's talking, everybody else is talking at this age. Everybody else can walk, my child can't. Well, maybe you can encourage the child to walk or talk. There are things you can do. Maybe you can ask for help. There are professional people who know about these sorts of things. But children are different. They're all different. And you're not going to turn around and ignore or despise your child because he isn't maybe as quick at some of those things as other children are at his or her age. And then you think to yourself, does God do that with his children? What did God do? Actually, Hosea 11 verse 3 speaks of God teaching Israel to walk by holding Israel by the hand. But if a child can't walk or talk, that isn't an issue of sin. You don't scorn him and despise him. God has given me this little child. And you don't do that. Let's say you've got a boy, probably more of an issue with boys, who aren't that good at sport. And you were. And you'd always wanted a boy who would be a great sportsman. And your sporting career is over because you're too old. And you want to sort of enjoy it through your son. That may be understandable. But if your son is no good at sport, and he's one of the ones that's picked last at the games, then there's no reason to put him in the doghouse or reject him, or view your son as some sort of failure, because he'll pick up on that. You love the son that God has given you, not the one that you imagined or wanted to have. And if your child is not at the top of the class at school, you don't say to him, now, you're going to have to get up and spend all Saturday doing your homework, or you're going to have to stay up an hour later every day before going to bed. Or unless you get really good grades and you're in the top 5 in over half of your subjects at school, you're not going to get a birthday present this year. Because God makes children different, and maybe that child's abilities lie in more manual skills. And there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. If, on the other hand, your child is lazy, now we're getting something. If he's lazy, if he spends all his time playing games on the computer and doesn't do his homework, then you want to talk with him about that, because that is sinful behaviour. He has a calling to do his schoolwork. Then we're in the realm of discipline. You see, the key is, how does God care for his children? Did God say to Israel, for instance, my son's no good. My son isn't the great engineer like the Egyptians. I disown you. Israel's no good because Israel doesn't have hanging gardens like the Babylonians. I'm not interested in the child. He's only a second rater. Israel is an embarrassment to me because though the men of Tyre and Sidon are great soldiers, or great sailors, the 12 tribes aren't, and I'm disgusted with them. For I wanted great athletes amongst my children, like the Greeks. And sometimes I wonder if Israel's really a son that's worth having at all. God didn't chastise Israel for any of those things. He chastised Israel because of Israel's sin. Then God frowns. Then God chastises because of sin. Not the other things. And if you ask, well then how does God discipline us, his children? You would have to say that God disciplines his children wisely, appropriately, with the chastisement specifically fitting the sin oftentimes, and in such a way that we ourselves can see it. Isn't that what you say? Don't you admit that God is good in chastising you, or do you complain? No. Good. Wise. Well, how did God chastise various people in the Bible? Think of Eli. Eli's problem was he was an indulgent parent who was too soft on his children, and though he rebuked them, it was far too mild. far too late, and he didn't put teeth in it. Too soft on his children. So how did God chastise Eli? Well, part of it was that Eli saw two of his sons, both of them die in one day. That was chastisement for him. David, his great sin was adultery with Bathsheba. God chastised David in that the child was lost in infancy. Physically died. And then, since David secretly had lain with another man's wife, God said he would chastise David by having Absalom, his own son, lie publicly with David's concubines, bringing great shame upon the psalmist of Israel. And since David's sin in adultery with Bathsheba was a sin against his family, God said, I will put a sword in your family and you will have grief in your own home. And so Absalom was raised up. He revolted against his own father. That is special. The great sin of Solomon was that he took many pagan wives. God chastised Solomon by giving Solomon over to some degree and for a time to the sin of idolatry. To stay with one more king in Jerusalem, Hezekiah. Hezekiah proudly showed the ambassadors of the king of Babylon around the treasure chamber. Look at all my wealth. God sent Isaiah to tell Hezekiah this. Because you've proudly showed off your wealth, I'm going to cart the whole thing off to Babylon. God did that. Chastisement. Wisely, appropriately, fitting the sin as a model for us in our treatment of our children, so that our children can understand that the chastisement fits the sort of sin that they've engaged in. It isn't always possible, but it's a guideline where possible. And from these examples that I've shown you here, you see some of the methods of chastisement. The loss of things and privileges. God did that to his people. Since you have abused these things, taken these things for granted, sinned with these things, you're going to have to do without them for a while until you learn to use them properly. That's simple. Even people in the world do it because it's kind of obvious. God uses the rod on his children. And the instances I've given are instances that God calls the rod. Psalm 89 says that God would bring the rod down upon the kings of Israel when they sinned. These are examples of the rod hitting them. And so God himself, who uses the rod on us, tells us that we must use the rod where appropriate and within measure, and after properly explaining the gravity of the sin and so forth. And that's especially in the book of Proverbs 23 verses 13 and 14. And later we read that the rod and reproof give wisdom. And then of course there's the other factor. In all of these instances that I just cited, God sent prophets to the one who sinned, to explain to them what evil they did wrong and how God was going to chastise them. And of course this is what we do too. Very obvious. We admonish, we reprove, we explain to our children what they've done wrong, why it is serious, how this contradicts the word and will of God, and then chastise them. It needs to be pointed out in our day, whereas this probably didn't need to be said in previous ages, that there has to be an element of pain in chastisement. You heard me right. There has to be an element of pain. At the very least, there has to be an element of pain in the conscience. That's the worst case to have pain. You admonish the child, you rebuke him so that he feels guilty. He ought to feel guilty because he sinned.